So we're going to be talking about um, this concept called the embedded narrative. All right. In films, novels, uh, paintings, there's a main narrative, a main story being told. All right. And then sometimes an artist will embed another one within it. All right. Think of it almost as maybe like a subplot. All right. And that embedded narrative, right, um, often can help us figure out what is actually the message, the argument being made by the work as a whole. All right. So this idea that this embedded narrative, this subplot, right, can highlight what's going on in the main plot or the main depiction, right? And in this case, we're talking about visual art. So something happening in a painting that seems small, right, that's sort of buried almost within a larger work, can actually tell us something about perhaps how to think about the work as a whole, or what the artist is arguing um, in their work, what they're using their work to say. All right. So I've brought up a painting. I'm on the website of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, and I've brought up a painting by the Spanish Renaissance artist Rodrigo de Osona the Elder. All right, it's the Adoration of the Magi, which is a typical subject um, in Renaissance art. All right, it's a moment from the New Testament. All right, here we have the Christ child has just been born. All right, here's the Virgin Mary, his mother. Here's his father, Joseph. All right, and it's this picture depicts he's born. A star is seen in the sky, right? And these three magi are wise men, basically leaders of different countries, right? Um, in the known world, see this star and follow it to Bethlehem, and they come to pay their respects to the Christ child and his family. So you see one of the magi here about to kiss the foot of the Christ child out of respect and deference. And here are the other two um, magi, right? Um, the last figure, sort of major figure in this, is right here. And there are a couple explanations as to who this could be. One of the common tropes you will find in art, in religious art of this period, is that oftentimes the donor was painted into it, right, into a piece of religious art of this time. And the donor meaning the person who donated the money to the painter or to the church to have this work of art made, right? So when a painter would paint a donor into a work of religious art, the idea was this was the way a way of the donor sort of saying, "Hey, I would like to be seen as holy and religious. Can you please paint me into this?" Right? And it may seem to us a bit crass and a bit sort of a bit cynical, and perhaps it is. But it was not uncommon during this period. You'd even have sometimes some people, church officials, being painted into paintings who did not pay, of course, for the privilege, but as a way to sort of link an image, a religious image that's sort of timeless, to a specific place and to a specific time, right? So that would be this figure right here. All right, so that's the main narrative. Now you will notice that Osona's picture is busy, right? There's a lot going on. And we're going to focus on what's happening sort of further back in the picture plane, all right, in the background. So I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger, and it gets a little fuzzy, but I think we'll do just fine here. So I'm going to focus on what's going on right here, all right? And I'm going to sort of cherry pick this particular detail. So I'm going to call what's going on right here an embedded narrative, sort of a smaller story, right, that's embedded in a picture with the main one, all right? That can actually lend some sort of interesting gloss on what's happening in the main picture. So if we look at this section of the painting, right, we will notice a ship, right, and it is heading west, all right. It's going this way. Here's the horizon. You'll notice that the wind seems to be blowing the clouds this way, all right. So that ship is going west, and it must be a sunset, all right. It's going toward the sun. As we know, the sun rises in the east, pardon me, and sets in the west. So this being a Spanish picture, right, by a Spanish artist, it is safe to assume, and when we analyze and interpret visual art, we are making assumptions based on evidence, right? But I think it is safe to assume that this is a Spanish ship, right? And at this time, Spain had a very powerful navy, right, and a very powerful fleet of merchant ships, right? And on this ship, I'm going to make another sort of safe assumption, I think is safe. On this ship may very well have likely have been the Spanish conquistadors, because this is also the time in which Spain was starting to make contact with what they would call the New World. It was not very new to the folks already there, but Spain, would call it the New World. So the ship was taking conquistadors and probably Franciscan friars or monks to the New World. They would do the sort of conversions to Christianity, while the conquistadors would take care of the politics and the sort of wealth acquisition, right? So again, here we have this Spanish ship heading to the New World, right? I'm going to make that educated guess here. On that ship would have been conquistadors and the monks they brought with them to convert the native populations. And as we know from history, Spain's contact with the New World certainly benefited Spain. It did not benefit um, the native populations in Central and South America. It was incredibly damaging, to say the least, right? And there's a long history of devastation to those communities, right, that were already existing for thousands of years in the so-called New World. All right, so the question has to be asked. I'm just going to back this image up a little bit. Okay, the question has to be asked: why would Osona paint this image, right? Embed this narrative, this story of New World conquest and exploration, right? Embed that in a picture with the Holy Family, with the birth of Christ, because those two things did not happen at the same time, right? So why would Osona do that? Well, that's our job as interpreters of visual art, and also as students of history, right, and students of narrative, to figure out why he might have done that. So I'm going to sort of go with two different schools of thought here, right? With an embedded narrative like this, you could argue, right, that it's this embedded narrative sort of furthers the argument, furthers a more positive argument, possibly, right? A more celebratory argument, or it actually argues something a bit more problematic about what's going on. So I'm going to do both here. So the first thing we can say, possibly, right, what the artist is using this embedded narrative to say is that here we are on this ship, right, with the monks, is this story, right? We are bringing Christianity to the New World. We are bringing the story of the Christ child and Christ, Christ's sacrifice, right? Which the idea was that it was supposed to cleanse us of our original sin, right? And of course, the Spanish are going into the New World, this sort of New Eden, right? And they're going to help the sort of quote unquote barbarian native populations who don't know Christ and Christianity and their Judeo-Christian God. They're going to sort of cleanse these backwards peoples of their original sin through the knowledge of Christ and his life. All right? So this ship is taking that news, the good news as it's called, to the New World. So here in the foreground is a very visceral example of what's going onto that ship. All right? And this picture is meant to celebrate Spanish conquest of the New World and the enlightenment of the native populations about the importance and sort of centrality of Christianity, right, to human existence. Okay, that's one possibility. You can also take a somewhat more jaundiced view of what's going on here, and perhaps you can argue that Osona is actually bringing up a problem. All right, you could argue that through this ship up here, right, that's going off to Spain, to New Spain, right, to the New World, that in the conquest and the sort of destruction of natural resources and the pillaging of them and the subjugation of native populations that which have a long history and rich culture, that this is very much at odds with what's going on down here, right? So perhaps through this embedded narrative of the ship traveling west, right, Osona is saying, what we're doing is not right. We are celebrating this in Spain, right, as Catholics, but we're also allowing on this ship to go to the New World these folks who will conquer, right, and do great damage. And so what I've given you is an example of how this embedded narrative here, right, can serve different rhetorical purposes depending on what you want to argue. Because I'm using visual evidence, right, I can really argue either one. And if I want to, I can go further and look for other things in this painting that might support either argument that I choose to take, that I choose to sort of to back up. All right. So again, here's my embedded narrative. I give you two examples of how it could be used to shine light on the main narrative, right? And in this case, you may end up finding that in some ways the embedded narrative is more complex and problematic than the main one. And sort of maybe you could argue that Osona is throwing more weight behind this. He makes it smaller, right? We have to work harder to see it, but if we do the work, we'll notice a much richer story. All right. So that's how we can use the concept of the embedded narrative to make it a much richer interpretation of what's going on in this picture. So it's not just another adoration of the Magi scene, which was a very popular scene to depict in art at this period. There's a lot more going on, and Osona, I sort of mentioned, I think that he's sort of a very busy artist. There's a lot going on here, but that's for a good reason, right? He doesn't simply want to paint the adoration of the Magi. He wants to embed more narratives. He wants to make it a much richer viewing experience, but also say a lot more, right? Argue a lot more possibly about his own culture. So you're going to take this idea of the embedded narrative and what you've learned, and you're going to apply it to another painting, and you're going to be you're going to see and going to wrestle with another instance of how an embedded narrative next to a main one, right, creates this interesting conversation. So I'm just going to go to that image really briefly. It's an image by the English painter Sir Joshua Reynolds. So I'm just going to type it in really briefly here. Oops. If I spell it right, it works even better. All right, and again, I'm just searching the database here of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. All right, and I'm going to locate the painting that I want, and here we are. All right, so we're going to move ahead in time, right? So we're just in the Renaissance, and now we're going to be moving to the Age of Enlightenment. We're actually not going to compare the two paintings, but just to give a little context as to where we are historically, all right? This is a portrait, all right, of a wealthy woman, right? This is Anne, the Viscountess Townsend, and a Viscountess is a title conferred upon someone by the king or queen, all right, which means Anne here is of very high status. And later, she was given the title of Marchioness, and her name changed along with it, all right. So you kind of move up the ladder, or you can marry into, or you can marry someone. So she very well may have married into her next title. All right. This is by the English painter Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was a very famous and sought-after portraitist. So if you were wealthy, you had your portrait painted, and Joshua Reynolds was one of the most famous. He was also the head of the British Academy. All right, which was sort of the taste sort of setting apparatus, and sort of decided what good taste was, right, in art of this time. All right. So we pointed out an embedded narrative in the Adoration of the Magi, and I'm going to point out another embedded narrative in what seems to be a very straightforward portrait. All right. I'm going to sort of increase the size a little bit, and I'm going to scroll down. And you'll see here that Anne is leaning on a plinth, or this sort of square, almost like a shelf, as it were. All right, in the ground. And you're going to see some figures here, sculpted, all right, beautifully painted here by Reynolds to get that sense of depth, all right. And this image, right, is from Greek mythology, all right, and it's the Judgment of Paris. So this is the moment in which Prince Paris of Troy is about to marry, all right, and a golden apple is thrown down, and it says. On the apple is inscribed to the fairest, right, meaning to the most beautiful. And Paris has to choose who is the most beautiful goddess, all right, Athena, Hera, or Aphrodite. And you're going to be reading some of the background about the Judgment of Paris. It comes to us mainly from Homer's The Iliad, all right, and you're going to be reading about it and possibly doing some research into this story. And you're going to be answering the question, what is Joshua Reynolds saying? Right? I'm going to go more broadly. What is he saying about women? All right. If Anne is sort of this prototypical sort of upper class woman, right? What is Reynolds saying about women? Or you can go more specific and think upper class women, but we'll think about women. What is he saying about women by including this image, this embedded narrative? And this really is a narrative. It's from a epic poem. right? So what is Joshua Reynolds arguing by putting this amongst this larger portrait, right? How does the embedded narrative, right, comment on what's going on? How does the embedded narrative here, right? What does it hint at about what Joshua Reynolds is arguing about women? So you're going to be using your skills, right, at decoding the embedded narrative to sort of get at a meaning or a possible interpretation as to what Joshua Reynolds is saying about women.